Oh hi, I didn't see you there. My name is Bliss Foster, and today we are going to be talking about A Cold Wall, Fall/Winter 2019 by Samuel Ross. For most guys who are into clothes, A Cold Wall has been something that's been on our minds for years at this point, but I would say that Samuel Ross has really made his shows into a spectacle that makes them unignorable for all of fashion at this point. Even if you're not a diehard fan of A Cold Wall, I encourage you to watch this entire video because this runway show actually does a really good job of showing us the ways in which a runway show can communicate to an audience. A lot of times there's just like a theme or a source of inspiration, and they bring that inspiration into the runway show through the clothes and the models and the music and the location. This one goes multiple steps beyond that and does a whole lot more. We'll get into it. I feel like the best way for us to dive into this and actually explore the show is going to be through the show notes that Samuel Ross and his team provided to the people that actually attended the show. Show notes are generally used as an artist's statement about a runway show that sort of tell you where they got the inspiration from and contextualize it in any way that they feel is necessary. And as usual with these runway show analysis videos, I strongly encourage that you go and actually watch the show itself. I'm linking it in the description, I always do. It really helps to contextualize what we're talking about here if you've actually watched the original runway show video. There's a real haunting feeling to these looks that really can't be communicated if I'm just showing you the pictures. Alright, cool, let's do this. A Cold Wall, Fall/Winter 2019, titled Birth, Organ, Synth. Okay, so before anything else, let's go ahead and do a quick who, what, when, where for this runway show. A Cold Wall is a fashion brand by Samuel Ross. For a while they were going as a streetwear brand, but it really isn't useful to call them that anymore. Even very purposeful, well thought out streetwear brands like Palace and Supreme just don't even seem to be in the same universe that Samuel Ross is in anymore. A Cold Wall started getting covered by a lot more of the fashion press the season prior to this one, Spring/Summer 2019, and he has taken full advantage. He basically uses his shows to be installation art pieces at this point. He's in London Fashion Week appearing as menswear, but really it's unisex, and he does a lot of women's looks throughout the show anyway. The show took place at the Truman Brewery, which is in one of the arts districts in London. It's a pretty typical spot. There's a lot of fashion shows that go down there because it's a property with just a ton of really gorgeous, stark spaces. As far as context goes, that's it. Let's get some show notes. Birth, Organ, Synth is a conceptual painting for this nascent age, embodying the progressive characteristics of the zeitgeist. For these parts of the show notes, I'm going to kind of try to rephrase what he's saying to maybe make it a little bit more immediately understandable. So basically, Birth, Organ, Synth is a piece of art for this age of potential that we find ourselves in, showing the way that culture continues to progress and to grow. Clothing is engineered and carved, fusing new components in a collage of distillation. This methodical process, which offers glimpses of core structures, a plethora of materials, and well-considered techniques, organic brushstrokes, embodying the artisan's studio of thought. Okay, stay with me, don't give up. I think basically what he's trying to say there is new clothing that he's making for a fashion show or that anyone's making for anything. New clothing is made by attempting to add small tweaks to items that are the result of thousands of years of design. You're trying to contribute to that lineage of design. Your process of designing kind of opens up the full field of the history of the design, and you can kind of see that full scope in the process of your own work to make it better. In the last 4 years, the lexicon of A Cold Wall has grown to include a distinctive canon of semiotic garments, protective utility vests, tailored tracksuits, overlocked knitwear, screen-grabbing graphics, and hard-wearing materials borrowed from overexposed environments. So here Samuel Ross is using a couple of different terms that help to kind of frame the way that he thinks about a collection. The word lexicon, the word canon, and the word semiotic are all three words that get used in the literature world. Yay! For 30 shining seconds, Bliss gets to use his 4-year degree. To put it super simply, lexicon basically just means the things that make up a language. So like just sounds, words. The word canon, I think, can generally be swapped out for the word genuine in this usage. Not so much like ivory tower fashion, but like fashion that is a true reflection of life. And the word semiotic, I want to slow us down just a little bit and unpack that word a lot. I know we still have a lot to go in the show notes, but I feel like this word is the one where Sam would want us to stop and take some time to fully flesh out what it means. Here we go. Semiotics is a study that's within the broader field of linguistics that has a lot of different definitions and spirals in all kinds of different directions, but to keep it super simple and understandable, semiotics talks about signs, which are anything that can hold meaning. The most simple definition of signs have them divided up into two parts: the signifier and the signified. So if I say the word tree, when I make the sound tree, that is the signifier. That is a sound that means something to you. And in my head at least, the thing that pops up at the sound tree is this. That's the signified. So we have the sound up here, the thing that's making the meaning up here, and we have the way you understand the meaning down here. Signifier, signified. What makes semiotics so interesting is that when I say tree, everyone is going to have different ideas of what tree means. And I don't really have any control over what your impression of a tree is. If I say tree, I mean, some people might just think like a lone oak tree in the middle of a white plain. Some people might think of the redwood forest. Some people might think of the fig tree in their apartment. Some people might have a very complex relationship with that sound because they fell from a tree and broke both of their legs when they were 7 years old. So it becomes interesting that like a single sound, which we have in English at least millions of sounds that mean supposedly very specific things, but because everyone has these full lives of experience behind them, those words have these deep oceans of meaning behind them that I, the person saying tree, have no control over. All right, let's keep going. Rewinding just a bit. In the last 4 years, the lexicon of a cold wall has grown to include a distinctive canon of semiotic garments: protective utility vests, tailored tracksuits, overlocked knitwear, screen-grabbing graphics, and hard-wearing materials borrowed from overexposed environments. The materials borrowed from overexposed environments is probably a good place for me to remind everybody. Samuel Ross is very inspired by working class professions. The need to get a job done produces some of the weirdest clothing ever. And Samuel Ross has said before that he just will pick a specific profession and then just kind of follow that person through their day and sort of make notes and do sketches and take pictures of like all of the wild stuff that they have to put on their body to get their job done. All right, show notes. These totems are constantly reinvented with an innovative lens. This season, nylons are reflectively piped, jerseys and fleeces are vegetable dyed, compasses are hiding within garments, badges are hand sewn, raised rubber logo plaques double as fasteners on trousers to alter the fit. The collection also marks a debut denim collaboration with Diesel and showcased new reiterations of a cold wall by Nike. We don't yet know what the Diesel collaboration actually looks like because we don't have any press images of it yet, but my guess is that it is probably one of these looks. Diesel has been finding some really cool talent lately. They worked with Shane Oliver a while back, and they also did a collaboration with Y Project. Like, very good choices, Diesel. And also the Zoom Vomero 5 that they've done with Nike for a couple of seasons now is extremely cool and has its own kind of unique story. I don't see that tying into this show super well, so it's, I mean, probably there because collaborations do make a lot of money for a brand, and it's just a badass sneaker, so it's like, why not throw it in there? Outerwear is a key story, representing codes of strength, heroic utility, and protective cocooning. Puffer jackets aren't just puffed up. They're sculpturally molded from memory nylon to ergonomically echo the curvature of the body. Cutouts on structural wool jackets create a sense of three-dimensional depth. Grids borrowed from analytical computer programs are hand-printed. Movement is the key ideology to birth organ synth. Ross explores the oscillation between dynamic liquid forms and static flatness, creating physical screenshots of molten movement and the natural life cycle of an organic product. The phrase modern also becomes a leitmotif, an ideology even. This is another paragraph where we find a lot of complicated phrasing, but what I think Ross is trying to communicate when he talks about the oscillation between dynamic liquid forms and static flatness is looks like this, where we've been shown the grids borrowed from analytical computer programs that are hand printed, and where you see the briefcase that's in the model's hand, and that's kind of the image of static flatness. And then we get to see what the exact same print looks like when it's being used on cloth that is movable. And even with a pretty tried and true silhouette, we gain this new appreciation for it because it has all this depth and twist and curvature to it. And as for the phrase modern, that's printed onto a lot of the bags and the scarves, other accessories, along with the phrase a cold wall. I don't know if this means anything, but in this specific look, the stylist folded the scarf so that it cut the letters off to spell moi, French for me. So maybe something about the wearer being very modern themselves? I don't know, maybe that's reaching. As an exploration of ever-evolving manufacturing methods, Ross has explored several unconventional techniques to imbue each piece with modern craft. There are sculptures created from welding steel, bowing jesmonite, whilst casting clay and cement. 3D printed surfaces are heavily textured. Die cutting gives an unparalleled precision to knitwear and leather. So die cutting is just referring to these looks here. Cutting out a little hole in the middle of stuff like that is referred to as die cutting. Hardware is artfully considered, with translucent, debossed, and embossed logo graphics. Again, reducing in size, panning away from a heavy print history, veering to one retaining a lucid memory actualized through use of clear acetate and transparent nylon patches, a confident progression. I think essentially what they're saying is we're trying to be less dependent on our clothes screaming a cold wall and let the designs speak for themselves. Pockets are concealed within seams that travel unconventional routes around the garment, mapping out the close relationship between the body, organ positioning, and garment functionality. Okay, this is something worth stopping and talking about. Throughout this A Cold Wall show, man, my bracelet just keeps coming undone. There we go. There are a few looks where we can see that the actual seams of the garment do hold pockets, which is a very cool little detail there. But substantially crazier is that there's a number of pieces within this A Cold Wall show that actually correspond to the layout of the organs in the body. Look 4 and look 29 clearly have stomach pockets, and then there's the two tinier pockets that I think are supposed to comprise of the heart, the left and the right side of the heart, because they're slightly offset from each other. The graphic on the hat in look 20 does an interesting flip on this concept by visually demonstrating the scope of peripheral vision for the organ of the eye. Finally, and perhaps most excellently, look 31 seems to be demonstrating the body positioning and the tools needed to perform open heart surgery. That is so cool. Like, where are the haters of Samuel Ross? I will fight you. However, for as much as there is an emphasis on innovative manufacturing, the human hand is increasingly important. Garments are carefully considered for practicality and comfort, a signifier of the growing number of A Cold Wall customers around the world, and the increasing presence of the brand in each of their lives. Here is a dance between the classic iconography of futurism, minimalist, clean, and refined, and an altogether warmer sense of the now and next. Prints and graphics are borrowed from the virtual bridges between communities across the world. There are pixelations of pebble dash walls closer to home, CGI graphics, geomaps, colors borrowed from thermoreactive scales. The part where he says the prints and the graphics are borrowed from the virtual bridges between communities across the world, I assume that's making reference to these graphics right here, which we can't really see yet. The Pebble Dash reference is a really interesting one. I'm not sure that I see any specific places in the show where it's being used. Samuel Ross is definitely an artist that puts an enormous amount of emphasis on process, and so there may be some part of the process that involved pebble dashing or something that visually looked a lot like pebble dashing that isn't necessarily evident in the final result. Or maybe I'm just missing it, I don't know. Geomapping companies help other companies by showing them information on a map through color. They tend to look something like this. And I think the general idea of a geomap was what inspired looks like these. And finally, the colors borrowed from thermoreactive scales, I think is just making a reference to the kinds of materials that tend to respond to the heat of human bodies. The most common place that we've seen this is with Stone Island jumpers and outerwear. And while fabrics that demonstrate heat can be manipulated to show that heat in all kinds of different colors, the most common is yellow, orange, and red, which inspired looks like this. This show also marks an unprecedented artistic installation for Samuel Ross. The viewing as a performative interpretation of a Renaissance painting, it opens with a global parable of intrinsic nature of progression and value of self-preservation. The dark, black water abyss is a symbolic interpretation of the collective individual's innate battle with carnal human fear and the crippling blindness that so often leads to nationalistic ignorance and the captivity of movement. All right, let's run that back again. I think the first point that they're trying to make in this paragraph is demonstrate that Samuel Ross is an installation artist as well as a fashion designer. He's said in a number of interviews before that he has a lot of interest in expanding his career outside of purely being a fashion designer, and installation artist is like another box that he's like already checked, because this show and the last Runway show that he did are installation art pieces, maybe even more than they are fashion shows, in a very good way. If you haven't actually watched the show, then we kind of need to talk about what makes it an installation art piece. To the left and to the right of the runway, we have shallow blackwater pools. Inside these pools were a few different people that were covered in black paint and had black clothing on that were slowly like creeping their way through the black pools. About halfway through, a Rottweiler was let out on a leash into one of the pools and was like aggressively barking. The figures were basically trying to lead each other through the water. Again, I really recommend that you go just watch the show. It's incorporated pretty seamlessly into the show and it looks really cool. In the second sentence in this paragraph, it says, the viewing as a performative interpretation of a Renaissance painting, it opens with a global parable of an intrinsic blah, 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 blah. Basically, this is starting off saying that this whole art piece is based off of a Renaissance painting, though it doesn't tell us which one. You'll remember that in the header for the show notes for Birth Organ Synth, it describes it as a conceptual painting for this nascent age embodying the progressive characteristics of the zeitgeist. And so here we see the painting part of this coming back, where it's based on a painting, and he in fact goes so far in basing it off of that the whole art installation he refers to as a painting. It opens with a global parable of the intrinsic nature of progression and value of self-preservation. So in the next paragraph, the show notes detail that the global migrant crisis was a large part of the inspiration for this. So it's pretty easy to see these figures that are trying to lead each other through this unknown area to a destination, but they're not sure where it is. The guard dog kind of intimidating them. All of this does seem to signify the plight of migrants regardless of which part of the world we're talking about. So when the show notes talk about the global parable of the intrinsic nature of progression and the value of self-preservation, I think that that's just referring to like the way that politics and just human life in general works. Sometimes it is necessary to get yourself up, get your family up, and to travel to another place in order to stay alive. The dark blackwater abyss is a symbolic interpretation of the collective individual's innate battle with carnal human fear and the crippling blindness that so often leads to nationalistic ignorance and the captivity of movement. So I'm really glad that we talked about semiotics earlier, because this does a really interesting flip on semiotics as it's used in art. So we have, remember, the signifier and the signified. The sound, tree, and then you have the many different things that people think about when they hear tree. So these shadowy figures in the black water are being used for two different things. It's being used to signify the migrants themselves, the global migrant crisis, but it's also being used to signify the people who are choosing to keep those people out because they're afraid. One signifier, which is the dark shadowy figures in the water, and then we have multiple signifieds, the migrants and the people trying to keep them out. By framing his metaphor like this, he kind of zooms out a little bit from the politicalness of it and he kind of talks about like the human journey in general, where like these people are acting out of fear, and so they're leaving this place where they're afraid that they might be hurt, and then these people are acting out of fear in trying to keep everything the same and keep other people away from them. And I think his message about the global migrant crisis is pretty clear, that it should be allowed to happen. But I think it's interesting that Ross kind of gets empathetic with the people who are trying to prevent migrants from moving into their country, showing that everyone is acting out of this place of intense fear. It speaks to the color and temperature of the era into which we have marched. It is the wake of political turmoil and the global migrant crisis. It is an elected oscillation between the two states of feeling that have dominated the last century of our culture. It is the feeling of spiritual apathy and mental numbness in an age of monotonous muscle memory scrolling. It is the base fear of what comes next, how it sounds and what it looks like. In these uncertain times, it is not just about the classic ideas of protection and utility. Self-preservation is the key to survival. A lot of the final paragraph here is pretty self-explanatory, but what I think is really interesting is that if you look closely on the pictures of the models, they have beads of water running down all of their faces. And if you look at the pre-production test shots of the models, it shows them standing on the Blackwater pool. I think what Samuel Ross is trying to say here is that these are the people who have emerged out of the fear into the modern era, and they have to find what direction they're going to go in. The compass motif is really interesting because all of the compasses that are incorporated into the clothes are being held vertically rather than horizontally. And the way that magnets work, they don't work if they're vertical. So they have nothing to tell them where to go in this new era. They have to mark out a path for themselves. And I'm convinced that Samuel Ross does have a positive outlook on where this is all going, because again, if we go back to the header of the show notes, it says, Birth Organ Synth is a conceptual painting for this nascent age, embodying the progressive characteristics of the zeitgeist. The word nascent means beginning to show signs of potential. In that sentence and multiple other times in the show notes, he talks about progression, growth, going up. Ultimately, there's this very sobering, serious message about the very real political situation of the global migrant crisis that's being communicated. I think there's also this kind of youthful optimism that Samuel Ross displays near the end here, kind of a little up twist at the end, where he seems to be saying, I don't know exactly where we're going, but I'm excited and I know we can get there. Thank you as always for joining me. Please go follow me on Instagram and on Twitter. I'm at Bliss Foster, absolutely everywhere. I am obsessed with each and every one of you, and I will eat you to gain your power and keep you forever. Goodbye.